Welcome back to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, Neil Clarke, standing in for George and Gatry. The NHS is the most enduring achievement of the first post-war Labour government of Clement Attlee. But now our health service faces arguably the most serious crisis in its 70-year existence. Forced to make $22 billion worth of savings by the government by the year 2020, the head of NHS England, Simon Stevens, recently announced that waiting times for so-called non-urgent operations would rise, meaning misery for 3.7 million people. Stevens says that due to the combination of an ageing population and the rise in demand for services, the NHS simply must make choices about its priorities. But with all the wealth there is in the country, should we be rationing our healthcare? Joining me now to discuss these issues is Dr. Bob Gill, a family GP from Kent and the producer of the great NHS Heist, a crowdfunded film about the dismantling of the NHS. Dr. Gill, welcome on board the Sputnik. It's great to have you here. Simon Stevens has said that basically if the NHS wants to prioritise on cancer treatments, then they've got to make £1 billion of savings, and that the waiting list for so-called non-urgent operations has to rise, probably beyond the 18-week limits at the moment. But is that really fair? I mean, it surely the crisis is that we're not getting enough money in the NHS in the first place, and this $22 billion the NHS has got to save inevitably means that waiting lists would rise anyway. And in fact, already I read that the waiting list for non-urgent operations is at its highest for 7 years.
Well, Neil, what people have to realise is we are entering the end stages of a 30-year-long privatisation plan. And what Simon Stevens is outlining is to create longer waiting lists and to use that as a driver for the insurance industry. Because what is happening behind the scenes is the NHS has gone from a public service, which has been largely publicly provided and funded through taxation, to a system based on the American model, which is run by the insurance industry, driven for profit, not based on patient care, but your ability to afford insurance. And in order to drive that market, you have to create waiting lists.
Because waiting lists were relatively low, weren't they, back in 2010, but they've shot up now. The government's Health and Social Care Act of 2012, which basically denationalised the NHS, didn't it? How has that impacted on this?
Well, the 2012 Act, which you mentioned, did several things. It removed the duty of the Secretary of State to provide comprehensive universal healthcare, effectively abolishing the NHS. And what we've seen since 2010, under the cover of the austerity agenda, is a deliberate defunding of the NHS. So the settlement for the NHS, which was historically around 4% growth per year, has shrunk to less than 1% per year. So in effect, we have built into the NHS severe underfunding, and we're seeing that in deterioration for the staff's working conditions, and we're also seeing that in the poorer service that patients are getting. And to include on top of that, preparing the public for longer waiting lists, well, who will benefit from all this bad news? The insurance companies waiting in the wings.
And of course, is this dichotomy really between so-called non-urgent operations and cancer operations really fair? Because these non-urgent operations, many of them, the patients are in extreme pain. My mother, for example, is in her late 80s. She's waiting for a hip replacement. She's in great pain. And of course, the danger is, isn't it, that actually health would get worse for people who are waiting for these operations, which could create more costs in the longer term.
With any of these proposals, the government have to put forward a plausible narrative. It might sound reasonable on the surface to prioritise cancer, and who could argue against that? But what is lying behind this is the agenda to convert to an insurance company insurance system. But you're right, patients who are on waiting lists are suffering, they're in pain. Some of them may develop complications, for example, a hernia that might strangulate, and you end up with a very serious operation.
Which costs a lot more.
Costs a lot more, puts the patient at jeopardy. And for hip replacements, patients are in pain, they're at higher risk of falling. So the government are quite prepared to increase the unnecessary suffering of patients to force through their privatisation agenda.
Why isn't there more of an outrage about this, Dr. Gill? Because this is pretty scandalous, isn't it? We put in $500 billion to save the bankers' bailout in 2008. And the NHS is being forced to make 22 billion of savings. Why isn't there more public outrage? And what can we do? What practical steps can people who support the NHS do?
Well, there is a large degree of public unawareness and ignorance. This is fueled by lack of coverage of these issues or lack of analysis, particularly on the BBC. You get a superficial analysis, and the solution tends to be propagating the privatisation. So we have to break out of the collective silence and try to educate and inform the public. That's the first thing. But the other important thing is to understand how this fits into the grand scheme of the insurance conversion. And that takes a little bit of understanding and explanation. That's why we've embarked on this film project.
Tell me about the film. Yeah.
Well, there are three elements to the film. There are three things that the private sector are after. First of all, the budget, 120 billion recurring NHS budget. They want that. Secondly, there's the land and the buildings. That's a terrific asset, most of which is planned to be sold off and handed over to property developers. And then finally, you have the data. NHS data is comprehensive, 50 plus million people within NHS England. This is a treasure trove of data to companies like Google and other companies who are waiting in the wings to get their hands on it. In fact, the Royal Free Hospital in London have done a deal with a company owned by Google, DeepMind, which they have handed over 1.2 million patient records. Now, largely, this is unknown of. But the other thing that people need to realise is their safety, their future care is being put at risk. In the meantime, effectively, the healthcare providers like doctors and nurses are being gagged by a culture of bullying and intimidation if they raise concerns. And one case that I wish to highlight, if I can, is that of Dr. Chris Day, who raised concerns about understaffing in his hospital. He raised this with a body called Health Education England, which looks after the training and appointment of doctors. And later he found that his training number, which is crucial to progressing your career, was removed. False allegations were made against him, and he's been fighting a 2-year-long legal battle through which it turns out a loophole in employment law excludes whistleblowing protection for all 54,000 junior doctors in the country, and the government have refused to close this loophole.
The public aren't really aware of this, are they? Because the BBC, as you say, the coverage is very superficial, isn't it? You have a NHS story every 6 weeks or so, and normally, as you said, it's pushing a sort of pro-privatisation agenda quite often.
Well, and what they're also doing is painting Simon Stevens as some innocent intermediary. But in fact, if you look at his past history, he was the chief executive of United Health Global, which is one of America's biggest insurance companies, and he's heading up NHS England. This really should ring alarm bells.
Reminds me a bit of the 1980s and British Rail, the way that the government there willfully underfunded British Rail. They got the public to turn against British Rail in a way, so that they could then come along in the 90s and say, look, British Rail isn't working, the trains aren't working, we've got to privatise. And hopefully the public would think, yes, well, it's got to be an improvement. Is there an element of that here?
That's exactly what's happened. We're now in the defunding stage. Then you get to making people angry, and the solution will be presented. Well, the only way to save this is top up insurance. So that's why you've got this waiting list announcement that they will increase. You will also have the restriction of services, such as restricting care for people who are overweight or who are smokers or who drink alcohol. So you have this narrative of the undeserving sick.
Yes, I've noticed that it's becoming more and more prevalent, isn't it?
And the erosion of social cohesion, softening us up for the final privatisation steps.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that the opinion polls show that saving the NHS comes very high on people's priorities. Yet when we get to general elections or even by-elections, it seems people vote for parties or candidates that actually haven't got a good record on the NHS. How can we make sure that the NHS, which is probably the biggest issue that affects all of us, we're all going to need it, we all do need it, how can we make sure that stays at the top of the agenda?
Well, I think it would be a mistake to wait for the next election.
Right.
Lots of damage is being done in the meantime. We need to put pressure on the political representatives to actually act in the public's interest. Unfortunately, Labour, Liberal Democrat and the Tories have actually colluded with this plan up to date. The Labour opposition are still very weak. They are not flagging up, as I have done with you, the end game, which is the insurance conversion. So there has to be a genuine groundswell of opinion amongst the public to put pressure and say, we're not having this. We've had privatisation of our utilities, our transport. We're having privatisation of our education system. We do not want that to happen to the NHS. We're going to end up with an insurance system which is concerned with generating profit at the expense of providing patient care, and that's not somewhere we want to go.
And it's interesting, isn't it? You talk about Labour, but there's savings that, you know, began under Labour, didn't they, in 2008-9, wasn't it, when the Labour Party put forward this plan for savings in the NHS, and the Conservatives have actually increased it, hasn't it? They made it worse.
Well, Labour fragmented the NHS.
Yeah.
It set up hospitals as foundation trusts, which are like independent arm's length businesses, and they also brought in this fake insolvency regime in 2009, which could justify the closure of hospitals based on the debts of neighbouring hospitals. But the other thing that Labour did before they left office was commission the QIP report, which was written by the management consultants McKinsey's, and in there it outlined the sale of 2/3 of NHS sites and also a 50% productivity gain within the staff. Now, how do you do that? Either you make them work twice as hard, or you get rid of half of them, or you downskill them. So a cheaper workforce, which would generate more profit. And this was Labour's legacy, I'm afraid.
Can the NHS be saved? This is the big question. I mean, it's probably on life support now. It's still doing a great job. You know, hundreds of thousands of doctors and nurses are doing fantastic work every day. Can it be saved? Is there still time, Dr. Gill?
There is time to save it. The insurance companies haven't taken it over yet. We need to flag up to the most self-interested amongst us that an insurance will not protect you in your time of need. When you become seriously sick and expensive, they will look for any reason to dump you, and you are left without care. That's how the insurance company works. That's how private healthcare works. So we need to look after each other's interests, because in fact that will be serving our own interests as well.
I mean, we have to look at the US, don't we, to see the nightmare of private insurance healthcare over there.
Yeah, so still in the US there's about 30 million with no insurance. They have to take the risk of out-of-pocket expenses if they become ill, and it's a major cause of a household bankruptcy in the US. We do not want to go to that system, and in fact there's a lot of pressure growing in the US for coming to a system closer to ours, and we're going in the opposite direction.
And the funding question, because is it simply a question of having more money and reversing these savings, or is it also structural changes to end privatisation, to end outsourcing?
We need to focus on where the NHS is hemorrhaging money. Private finance initiative is a major financial scandal which needs to be addressed. And also the running of the internal market and this market bureaucracy would save something upwards of 10 billion a year.
Wow.
So there isn't a reason to increase taxation or pretend that we can't afford it anymore.
We're the sixth richest country in the world, aren't we?
We are, and when the NHS was set up after the war, we were in much worse financial situation than we are now.
A very good point.
We do not need to increase funding. We need to restore the NHS as a public service to be publicly provided.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gill, for coming on the Sputnik, and all the very best of luck with your film, The Great NHS Heist. And people can donate to the crowdfunding page on the website.
That's right. Go to gofundme.com, and it's The Great NHS Heist.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for on the Sputnik this week. I've been Neil Clarke, standing in for George Angatri. And, as George would say, it's been marvellous.